Today, we're going to be talking about Hypermedia. So in the application that I've been building over the previous episodes, today we're going to add Hypermedia to the API. So please stick around and we'll get right on that. All right, so as I said, we're going to be creating some Hypermedia. Now, some of you might be asking, what is Hypermedia? Well, Hypermedia is links and other information that you can put out in your API to make it somewhat self-documenting. It allows other users or even applications to be able to read these links and read this information from your API. So if you have a JSON API, which we're building a JSON API here in these videos, then the links will be able to help applications and users know what actions that they can take afterwards, right? So it might be, if I want to update a record, what link do I use to update the record that I'm looking at in the JSON response? If I want to delete a record, what URL can I use to delete that record? So that's what we're going to create. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to create these using a little bit of automation. I'm going to use the URL helper that comes in Zend Expressive. In this case, we're using Zend Expressive as the micro framework underneath the API. If you're using another framework, I'm sure they have URL helpers as well to do that. I know Zend Framework does, Symfony does, Laravel, all those, I'm sure they all do. So whatever framework you've chosen to use, and you should use a framework, please, then do use those appropriately. But in these examples, I'm going to be using Zend Expressive. And so let's get busy. The first thing I want to do is update my routes, because my routes are what is going to drive the URL creation. I'm going to use the names that we assign to our routes to create the links inside the Hypermedia. So I'm going to open up my announcements module that we've been working in and bring up my routes delegator. Now in the routes delegator currently, we only have one route, and that is a get route. So it's an HTTP GET call, and it is using the /announcements, and then after that we're expecting page and then the number of the page. So again, we're using pagination in our result set, and it's expecting me to pass, or it's expecting somebody in the URL to pass the page number, page 1, page 2, page 3, and so forth. And then when it does that, it's going to call to our announcements read handler. And then we also have, as the third and final argument for the get call, what is the name of this route? And in this case, I've called it announcements.read. You can name it differently if you desire. I called this one announcements.read because it is the reads handler, so it kind of follows through. Now, one thing to note is, as you're specifying these routes, that third argument needs to be different for every single route. You can't use the same name for multiple routes. Otherwise, if you wanted to use those names, it would be confusing. Well, you wouldn't be able to, because the router would throw an error and say there's two routes named the same, and you can't have that. So to create these routes, there's a few different actions you might want to take, right? So for starters, one of the things that I might want to do is I might want to be able to create a new record, right? So I'll call app, and post would be a method that I would want to call, right? So that's one route that we'll need to specify is how do I create new records? Another thing I might want to know is how do I get the details about the current record, right? So that's going to obviously be a GET request. Give me the information on a specific record. Now the GET call we currently have is expecting pagination. On this GET call that I'm specifying here, that we will specify, I'm expecting to get an ID for a specific announcement in this case, because we're dealing with announcements. Also, another route that we might want to specify is, how do I update a record? And for that, we would use a put method. For that, we would use a put method. And so that would be one of our routes, is the put request. How would we route a put request? And then finally, what if I wanted to delete a record? So we would need another route to handle deletion of a record. Okay, so those are the various routes that we may need to specify, especially if we're dealing with a CRUD application. With the CRUD application, you need to be able to create, read, update, delete, and in this case, I'm specifying an additional route for viewing a specific record. So in some cases, your read might do multi duty, right? It might be the listing, and it might show the details of a specific record. In this case, I kind of like separating those. I like having my details of a specific record separate from the listing of those items. So in this case, I would have announcements show me a single one, or announcements show me a paginated record set of all of them. Now, to create these routes, for instance, for creating a route, let me get rid of the left panel there, because these can be kind of long lines. So for creating a record, it might look something like this, right? I'm doing a post, and in the post, I'm going to pass it in the URI. It's going to have announcements. Now, the trailing slash is optional because I put it in square brackets here. And then it's going to, when it does a create, it's going to call the announcement create handler instead of the announcements read handler. And then, of course, I've given it the name of announcements.create. So it's easy for me to look at that and tell exactly what it is, right? So that would be the for the creation of a new record. Now, also we have the additional get, right? And this is where we're expecting to see the details of a specific announcement. And how that would look is we're passing the slash announcements, but instead of the page, as we did in the other get, this one we're expecting ID. So our router is going to know it's expecting it to have either an ID argument or a page argument. And then it's going to call the announcements view handler, which we'll create later, versus going to the read or the create, right? And we're going to look at the view handler. And then, of course, I name this as announcements.view to allow me to use this route later if I wanted to. Now, as a put, we're using put for updating a record. For put, that would look something along this line, where I'm passing announcements. Now in the URL string, I'm specifying what ID I'm updating. And then it's, of course, that route knows to go to the update handler, announcements read handler, or announcements update handler. And I name it appropriately. I name the route using update. And then, of course, delete is very similar, where we're passing the ID of the record in the URL string, but because we're using the delete method, it knows to pass that to the announcements delete handler. And of course, we use an appropriate name for the route. So those are the routes that we're going to use for the CRUD portion of our application. So we've created those. So now we have those in place. Now we can actually address those as we're using a URL handler or a URL helper, rather. Okay, so let me close that because we're done with the routes, right? The routes have been created. Now we know what we're doing. But where I want to use those is in my handler. But first, I need to pull in the URL helper into our project. I'm going to do that in the factory. And the reason is because in the factory, I have the container. And the URL helper is accessible through the container. Everything is accessible through the container. So I'm going to specify URL helper here because that's what we're going to be defining. And to do that, again, I'm going to call it through the container, do a get, and I'm going to do URL helper. And I'm expecting Zend Expressive Helper, which is highlighted there. So I'm going to go ahead and use that. And I'm going to use it as the class. And so now I'm done with that. Now you'll notice that by allowing the autocomplete, allowing PHP Storm autocomplete to do that, it also created the import up here, the use statement for the URL helper. So now it's available to us. Now I need this URL helper in my handler. So I need to pass that as an argument So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tack that onto the end here as a third argument to pass into the read handler. Now I'm going to make this a little bit easier to read because right now I'm getting a little bit long because I'm using a really big font for these recordings. It does make the lines really long very quickly. So now for the announcements read handler, I'm passing in 3 arguments. One is the entity manager, then of course I'm passing in the page size from the configuration, and I'm passing now the URL helper. So that way we can utilize that inside the read handler. So now that I've got that there, I now need to go to the handler and use it. I need to go into the handler and use the URL helper. So I have that coming into the constructor as arguments. So let me go ahead and create a field for it. And so I'm going to create URL helper. So I've got that there. I'm going to expect it to come in as an argument, but I'm going to type hint it because I want to be able to know. I expect the application to be able to do some validation to make sure I'm getting the right thing. So we're going to call URL helper. And that is going to be a variable of URL helper. And you'll notice that as I typed that here into my arguments and type hinted it, PHP Storm created the use statement above, so that way we'll have our autocomplete that we might need. And I'm going to pass URL helper into the field in this class. So now we have that available for usage throughout the class as this URL helper. All right, so that's done. We've specified that. And now in the handle method, now we're going to be able to use this URL helper. Now, the reason that we want to use that again is because we want to use the URL helper to be able to automatically generate URLs in our Hypermedia based on our routes. So that way we don't have to retype those. And if we ever change the route, the name of that route will remain the same. So by using the name of it, it's automatically going to bring in any changes that we do to the routing later. And we don't have to worry about that. So now in the handle method, I'm going to go down here because after we get the records, right? So we've gotten the records. And here is where I want to specify some Hypermedia. Now, in this video, I'm going to be doing this somewhat longhand. I'm going to be creating an array. Now, there are automated ways to do this. In future videos, we will do this a little bit more automated. But to make this easier to understand for those who don't use Hypermedia at all, I wanted to do this longhand so people could see and get used to or get familiar with Hypermedia. So to do that, first I'm going to create my beginning items, right? So for Hypermedia, typically you're going to want your initial set. And that is, so we have our results array, or the result itself. And in the result, we're creating array items. We're creating an array item for per page, total pages, and then and those are just overarching data pieces that are inside the set, right? These are items that are going to be used, throughout whatever application is consuming this API. And we're using our temporary variables for this to populate these. Now, additionally, we have some subarray items here, because this is going to be a multi-dimensional array that then is going to be parsed into JSON. And so we're going to create various links. And this is where the links come in. The items above are metadata to define. However, these are links that people or applications would then know how to perform actions on the data here. So we have self, which of course is the current link to duplicate what a person might be looking at. For instance, maybe somebody saved the JSON response and somebody else was looking at it. How do I duplicate that? Well, here's the link for self, so I know how to duplicate this, right? And then we have, if I wanted to get the first page, the previous page, next page, last page, and if I wanted to create an additional record, or if I wanted to read all the records, how do I do that? And that's what these links are for. And these links will be populated inside the result set. And how we do that is we're going to use the URL helper that we defined earlier. And as an example, let's go ahead and create the self. So in self, we're going to call the URL helper, and we're going to call the method generate. Now, there's two arguments that we're going to pass into generate. There are more arguments that you can pass, but we're only going to use two in this video. And one is passing it the name of the route, right? So by using this name, the URL helper is going to know, oh, okay, this is a name that is already in the routes or should already be in the routes, and I'm going to generate the URL based on that. And then the second argument that we're using is additional parameters or arguments to add on to that URL. And in this case, we're expecting a page argument, and we're going to tell it the current page, and that's going to be, of course, an integer to then to add as an argument for that. So in the JSON response, then I would see this item for self. So additional items, of course, that we want to include would be the first record. And again, we're doing the same thing there. We're doing the same thing. We're going to generate a URL from arguments read, and we're passing page and then just number one. It's actually a hard-coded thing because if you're doing pagination, your first page is always going to be page one, right? So we're actually kind of hard-coding that in there to be able to use the record we're expecting. All right, and then we have previous. I'm going to go ahead and paste in some of the rest of these, and then we'll highlight ones that might need additional explanation. So we have next. Nope. My system is being taxed a little bit by creating videos, so it's not behaving the way that I would expect it to. So let me copy next, paste that in here. There we go. And then I'm going to do the last. Paste that in here. I'm going to do the same thing with create. Now create is a little bit different. So we're going to talk a little bit about that one because that's where the URL gets a little bit different, only because, of course, it's a different handler than what we were working with in the other ones, right? So it's much the same thing, except in this case, we're calling the announcements create instead of read as in the previous ones. The previous ones are expecting announcements read, and then it's giving a page argument to specify what page to show. However, in the create, it's expecting to create the create argument. So that way it's going to create a URL for the create method. And the same thing with read. Again, it's using read and it's passing page one, which is kind of the same thing as first, but it's good just for a little bit of redundancy just to have it there. How can I see all the results, right? So now if we were to go into our REST client and look at the results, then we can see now our Hypermedia is created. And that Hypermedia is actually for all the records, right? Let's see. Yeah, that's as high as I can take it. So that's for all the records. That's for the entire record set. We can see we've got our per page. We're expecting 5 records per page. This is page number 1. The total records is 11. And the total pages that we could view is 3. And then there's the additional links to duplicate this result, for seeing the first, previous, next, last, create a new record, so create a new announcements, and also for reading. Now, if we scroll down here, one thing we notice though is inside our embed, we see the individual announcements, and there's a bunch of announcements here, but there's no links for any of these, right? So we have the announcements listed here, but how do I update a specific announcement? How do I delete a specific announcement? We haven't created the Hypermedia for that yet. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So for that, of course, we have the individual records, and in order to have the links inside each record, we'll need to inject that in. So how we're going to do that is we're going to loop over the current results, right? The current records, we're going to loop over that. So we're going to create a for each loop, and in that for each loop, we're looping over the records and we're dumping them out as keys and values. Now, why are we doing that? We're doing that because I need the key, so that way I can make sure that I'm inserting the hypermedia into the correct item, into the same item that I'm looking at. And we also need the values because I'm going to need the ID, right? The ID needs to be part of the URL string. And you can see here in the individual records, so we're in records, we're passing the key so we know which record to inject this into. We're adding a links identifier, and we have self, update, and delete. So we're creating those 3 links in the hypermedia. We're using the URL helper. We're generating, we're passing in the name of the route to use. In this case, we're using the view. For updating, we're going to use update. And of course, for deleting, we're going to use the delete route. And then we're passing the ID into all those as additional arguments for the 3rd item. So now we've got the hypermedia and it's being injected into the individual records. So let's take a look at how that looks now that we've got that in there. So if I refresh this record set, we can scroll down to the individual item. And sure enough, there's our links. There's the links for this specific item. If I scroll down to the next item, that one's number 1. I can see that this one is number 10. And you can see that the IDs are there for viewing, self, updating, and deleting. So now our hypermedia is there. Now, again, I know some of you are probably thinking, oh, this is difficult. Look at all these lines of code that I would need to include in every single handler. And you're exactly right. That is a lot, right? It would take a lot of lines of code to do that for every single handler. There are more automated ways to do this. Expressive has a HAL component that you can use to do this a little bit more automated. I just wanted to use this video to kind of break ground, create some of this hypermedia for folks who haven't done it in the past to get kind of familiar with it and see how that's actually represented. In a future video, we will then automate this using the expressive HAL component and create these in a lot more automated fashion. So that way in 3 or 4 lines of code, we can then create the HAL in an automated fashion. It'll go to the repository and look at the entity and be able to create the hypermedia in a lot more automated fashion by looking at that. So I want to thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found it helpful. Please tell others about Beachcasts. Have them come and watch some videos as well. I greatly appreciate it. Remember to subscribe and also leave comments. Tell me what you thought. If you have any suggestions of how I can make this better or what you might like to see in future videos, leave that down in the comments as well. And any questions that you might have, please leave that. I really thank you for coming. Take care.